All right, so again, my name is Ed Kim. I'm with the New England Aquarium, and just thanks again for having me here to talk about some of our work tagging false albacore alongside the ASGA. Really happy to be here. All right, so first things first, just a quick intro to the aquarium itself. We have all sorts of critters up at the aquarium, and you're probably thinking about giant tanks filled with fish and turtles and all sorts of other animals. But we also have a scientific research branch called the Nantucket Cabot Center for Ocean Life, which has various teams dedicated to all different areas of research. And in particular, I'm a part of the fisheries team, which is made up of all those folks you see there to the left. And I just want to highlight two other people who are also associated with this project. They're in the upper left-hand corner. That's Caroline Kalatos, who's a PhD student at UMass Boston, and is also affiliated with the aquarium, as well as Dr. Jeff Kneebone, who's the one who originally spearheaded this project. And so these fish are called all sorts of names, and it's kind of made worse by the fact that people in different areas call them different things. So their official common name is little tunny, which of course almost nobody ever uses. And then up here in the Northeast, they're most commonly known as false albacore or albies, which is what I'll be referring to them as throughout the rest of this presentation. And then it seems that the more south you go, more towards Florida, that's the territory where they start to be called bonito or bonita. But it's not just names either. There's a couple different species of tuna, as well as fish that look like and are closely related to tunas that people get them mixed up with. So this first picture here, that's definitely an albie. They have these kind of worm-like markings on their back that's usually set among a background that's this greenish to bluish tint. And then they have lighter sides, and sometimes, but not always, they'll have a set of lighter spots more towards the front of their belly. And then below it is probably the fish that it's most confused with, and that's an Atlantic bonito, but these guys are easily identifiable just by looking at those horizontal stripes that come down a lot further on their sides. And they also tend to be more of a greenish tinge. And then a couple other species that are less commonly seen in our inshore waters. That's a skipjack tuna up there in the upper right-hand corner. They have markings on the underside of their belly. And below that is a bullet tuna, which is nearly indistinguishable to the naked eye from a frigate mackerel. Both of those species are not as deep-bodied as albies, and they also don't get quite as large. But if you're new to all this and you're trying to wrap your head around all that, just know that officially they are called little tunny. And if you're even more interested, their scientific name is Eutinus lateratus. And they can be found offshore, but they're perhaps best known for being coastal pelagics where they can be targeted easily by fishermen inshore. And they are relatively fast growing. So here in the US, they've been aged up to 5 years based on fish that ranged up to about 30 to 32 inches in length, although they have been aged up to 8 years elsewhere in the world. And while 30 inches is a good fish anywhere, that's definitely not as big as they can get. So the IGFA world record for the species is 36 pounds, which is absolutely massive. Typically 15 to 20 pounds is where you start getting into state record status along a lot of the states in the East Coast. And in terms of reproduction, they are relatively fast maturing at around 13 to 14 inches in length based on some limited studies, and they do spawn during the warmer parts of the year. But with all that being said, most of the studies on life history for this species does come from the Eastern Atlantic, around Europe and Africa, it seems, and there's not that many published studies here in the US, which obviously poses a problem for any prospective management of this species. And so while we're on the subject of life history, here's just a quick heat map showing distribution of them around the world. They're found on both sides of the Atlantic as well as into the Mediterranean Sea. And they are a warmer water species of tuna, which is why they're concentrated mostly around those lower latitudes. And while this is all still one species, there have been studies from the Eastern Atlantic showing that there are both genetic as well as morphological differences among regional populations. And while these fish can move around a lot, as tunas certainly are capable of doing, the presence of multiple stocks could potentially mean different management strategies, and all of that could also potentially have implications for the population on our side of the Atlantic as well. And it turns out that these fish can and do move around a lot. So to my knowledge, this is the first published large-scale tagging study on albies where they put conventional tags in them and then release them to see where they were recaptured and traveled to. And that plot, those black dots are showing where those fish were caught, tagged, and released. And then that's connected by the blue lines to the red dots, which is where they were recaptured. And in some instances, they actually ranged up to about 600 nautical miles away, which, to put that into perspective, is about where we're sitting here in Massachusetts down to around the Carolinas. And here in the US, this fishery has a huge following, and for good reason, because they are some of the hardest fighting fish that you can regularly encounter inshore. And having caught a bunch of them myself, I'll say that pound for pound, I don't think there's many other fish out there that will out-tug an albie. And while most people target them with light spinning tackle, just challenging getting them to even look at or eat a fly is a huge draw to a lot of saltwater fly fishermen. And I've also been out tagging for them in some pretty snotty weather when fishing would have otherwise been like the last thing on my mind. But I don't think I can recall a single day when there wasn't at least one other boat out there with us, and more likely a fleet of boats. And it's not just boats either, it's also people like jet skiers and kayakers. So those two guys there in the bottom right-hand corner I thought were particularly crazy for going out on that day, because there were some large swells, and if they had tipped over, they would have had a pretty bad day. But again, this is all just a testament to how hardcore of a following some people have for this fishery. And it's not like people are going after these fish when nothing else is biting either. So if you look at that plot, that's the number of trips where albies were the main or secondary target. And over time, there's been a steadily increasing trend to the point where there's now hundreds of thousands of trips annually. And the great thing about albies too is that they're accessible not just to boaters, which is a proportion of each of those bars in gray and orange, but shore fishermen also get into them with some frequency as well, which is the proportion in each of those bars in blue. So truly, this is a fishery that's accessible to different modes of fishing. And here, if we look at recreational landings in terms of weight, on that y-axis, it's easily measured in the millions of pounds. And below that, if we divvy that up by region into the north, middle, and south parts of the East Coast, the South, and in particular Florida, they dominate those landings. And all of this is just to say that you consider things like the number of people who takes trips, number of people who pay for recreational charters, all of those tackle and lures that are bought, and I guess just the overall draw of people to the coast who otherwise wouldn't have come if it weren't to fish for these fish. These fish do hold some economic value at least. And it turns out that most people probably go after these fish because of their fight and not their fillets. The overwhelming consensus here seems to be that these fish taste downright terrible because they have this relatively dark and bloody meat, and so they're better off being used for bait or just released. And I found this graphic while I was scrolling through an internet forum, and I thought it was perfect because this seems like it sums up public opinion pretty well. But it turns out that there's some other platforms out there that have tried and experimented with albies both raw and cooked, and some of them reported as being halfway decent. So I myself have actually tried eating an albie before. One of my best friends in grad school was walking along the beach one day, and a pod of them was chasing bait, and one of them stupidly beached itself. And so she scooped it up and brought it to me, and I kind of remember half cocking my eyebrow thinking, do we try to eat this thing? Because I heard how terrible they can taste. And then I thought to myself, what kind of scientist would I be if I didn't have empirical evidence of this for myself? So I blended it out as best I could. We put it in a cooler to chill out. I filleted it up, and then we had it seared later the night. And I think I can confidently say that I probably would never do that again. They have this tuna taste to them, just with this extremely gamey aftertaste. If you have a fish that's bleeding on your boat and it's bleeding badly, if you have a cooler, I would say give it a fair shake. But I personally think they're better off being released. And it turns out that according to this data, most of the albies nowadays are in fact released, which is what's referred to in our field of fishery science as discards. It seems that the further south you go, there's a higher percentage of them being kept. And I'm not sure if this is because people are actually eating all those albies, but it's probably a combination between that and them using them for bait, because again, as I mentioned, these fish are extremely bloody, so they make great bait for things like sharks as well as reef fish. And then also the skin on them is particularly tough, and so they make great sewn baits for trolling as well as for deep trapping for species like swordfish. And now looking at the commercial fishery, there has been an increase in landings over the past several decades. But if you look on that y-axis, it's measured more on the hundreds of thousands of pounds compared to millions of pounds for the wreck fishery. And once again, below that, breaking this up by region, it seems that the South, in particular North Carolina and Florida, are dominating those landings. And that picture to the right there is one that I snapped at a local fish market. And it's hard to see there, but the price on those is actually $2.99 per pound, which is exceptionally low for any sort of marketable fish. I've heard estimates from sources in Florida saying that they typically average around 50 cents per pound for false albacore, which again is not a very high price. And so in light of all these fisheries, there hasn't really been any sort of regulations on albies at any level up until very recently, like Chris discussed, which is striking given how important of a fishery they could represent for this recreational fleet. And so back in 2022, the ASGA teamed up with the aquarium to try to study and learn more about this species so that we could try to inform management and also just protect this resource while it's still relatively abundant. And there at the bottom, you can see how the ASGA has been involved in getting the public up to date on things like policy hearings, as well as steps being taken now and into the near future to manage these fish. And this is stuff that Chris actually just presented on, so I won't go over it ad nauseum. But basically, like he said, it's a start to precautionary management. It opens the door for future management talks, and also it encourages a lot of other states up and down the coast that have this fishery in their own waters to follow suit as well. And so that brings us to what we're doing here today to try to study these fish, which is a technique called acoustic telemetry, where we're using these tags that emit unique identifying pings of sound that register with receivers that we have out in the water whenever tagged fish swim close enough to those receivers. And the best way that we can kind of describe this to the layperson is that it's like a system of our phones and phone towers. So whenever you go out for a drive on a nice day and you have your phone in your pocket and you get close enough to one of those phone towers, your cell phone is actually pinging to that phone tower and saying you were at that given location at that given point in time. And so at the end of your drive, you essentially have a virtual roadmap of everywhere you've been relative to all of those phone towers. And it's essentially the same exact thing with acoustic telemetry. And we can use this to study things like post-release survival, which is exactly what it sounds like, where we're trying to measure that proportion of fish that are surviving that catch and release process, as well as looking at movements in Nantucket Sound as well as abroad to try to see how those fish are utilizing space so that we can also help inform management at what scale that management should be set at on a geographic range. And I know Tony said that I would be talking a little bit about post-release survival, but today we're going to be focusing mainly on the movement data here. We want to nail down that post-release survival before we really start talking about it in public. But that stuff will be upcoming. Don't worry about that. And so this is our study area, Nantucket Sound. I'm assuming most of you are at least somewhat familiar with the area, given that you were able to find your way here into the audience today. And also you're going to be fishing a tournament tomorrow, so you probably better know where it is. But it's home to all these amazingly productive fisheries that typically start to ramp up in the springtime of each year. And then as the water warms and we start getting closer to early to mid-August, that's when we start to see the arrival of these so-called funny fish, which is comprised of this trio of albies, bonitos, and Spanish mackerel. And all throughout Nantucket Sound, we have these Coast Guard 8 to navigation buoys, which are extremely convenient for us to hang our receivers off of. There to the left is showing what each setup looks like, where we have, it's basically just a length of stainless steel cable running through some PVC pipe. And then at the bottom of it, there's a bunch of sash weights so that it hangs down in the current. And then we just hose clamp our receivers directly to that. And then there to the right, we just motor up to that buoy, put a length of chain throughout the eye of it, and then through the top loop of that setup, and it's tossed overboard where hopefully it will detect any passing fish that come by it. And so this is just a map showing the locations of our most recent receivers in 2023. As you can see, we have decent coverage throughout Nantucket Sound, as well as around the island of Nantucket itself. Okay, now to the business of actually catching these fish. So we used 4 hire recreational charters with professional captains, as well as a ton of volunteer anglers. And we also used spinning tackle that was representative of that recreational fishery. And trying to find these fish can be a little tricky at first, but once you know they're in a general area, it's pretty straightforward. Just look for these characteristic moving splashes on top of the water where they're chasing bait. And if they're followed by birds, it's an even better indicator they're around. So the captain will then position the boat so that everybody can take a cast without spooking those fish. Everybody then takes a cast, and hopefully somebody gets bit mid-retrieve. And I will say here that these are some of the finickiest fish known to man. You can take 50 casts in a row doing everything right, and they will flip you the middle fin and not eat or not even look at it, much less eat it. But in terms of the date taken, we note things that like the specific tackle that was used, how big that fish was, the fight time from the moment it was hooked to the moment it was landed in the boat, the handling time from the moment it was in the boat through when it was tagged, and then over the side once we released it. And then lastly, we also noted to see how those fish were doing once they were swimming away. And the first type of tagging we performed is internal tagging, where we're surgically implanting that tag inside the body cavity of the fish. We use this to study movements because it minimizes any chance of that those tags being shed. So we see everywhere that fish goes as long as that battery is alive. And the tags that we used are called V13s, which were made by a company called Vemco. And they're called V13s because they're 13 millimeters in diameter. In terms of how tall they are, it's probably like that big. So overall, not a huge tag. But the procedure here is that once those fish are in the boat, they go straight into that homemade tuna tube, which is basically just an upside down traffic cone bolted to a trash can filled with seawater. And then there's just a bilge pump hooked up to a battery. And that's continuously flushing water up and over the gills of that fish as it's being tagged, so it's oxygenated throughout that entire process. And so once that fish is in the tube, that gives us easy access to the belly. I make an incision, insert that tag, and then it's a quick 1 or 2 sutures, and that fish is over the side of the boat and swimming off to wherever it wants to go, hopefully near some of our receivers. And the second type of tagging that we performed was external tagging, where we are attaching that tag to the outside of the fish using the setup shown there to the left, where it's rigged up with a dart head on a short tether, and then put on a tag stick so that we just poke it into the fish's back and that tag is affixed. And we do this to study post-release survival because it's a lot faster and less invasive than internal surgery. And so it gives us a more natural, accurate representation of that catch and release process. But the downside here is that those tags can and do fall off the fish, but assuming that they stay attached, we can still use that to study movement data as well. And so one of the biggest questions that all of us had going into this 2 years ago was, will this actually even work? Because we heard how susceptible albies can be to stress, and we didn't know if the act of tagging, let alone catching and handling them, would be too much for them to handle. But it turns out that yes, in fact, this technique does work with albies. So that first map is showing all the detections that we had across receiver stations in 2022 when we were first tagging. And then if you combine both of our years of effort, we had over 55,000 detections across 150 tags out of 160 that were deployed. And you can see the breakdown by internal versus external there. And then this second plot is just showing detections over time, where each of those gray dots is a single detection, and the gray X's are showing the tagging dates of each of those fish on that y-axis. And you can see here we had detections spanning throughout the duration of the fall of 2022 when these fish are typically known to be inshore based on observation. So again, more evidence for this notion that acoustic telemetry does in fact work with these fish. So this is just a short video I put together on the movements of all of our detected albies in Nantucket Sound 2022 across all the receiver stations, which are those black triangles. And as you can see, they utilize pretty much all of the sound where we do have receiver stations. And not just that, but they can also move pretty quickly from one end to the other. And this is just another video showing more of the same, this time with 2023 tags. As you can see, we've expanded our receiver array quite a bit to include a lot more stations, but it's just more of the same here from 2022, where they're bouncing all around throughout that array, and some at a pretty rapid rate. So definitely some interesting stuff to see here with how they utilize Nantucket Sound. Now, we really only see albies here in the late summer through the fall, which kind of begs the question, where do these fish go throughout the rest of the year? And luckily for us, scientists have acoustic receiver arrays just like ours all up and down the coast, so that whenever our tagged fish swim into their arrays, they can get detected. And also vice versa, whenever their tagged fish swim to our array, we can get those detections. But we really only know the tag ID and not who owns it, much less what species it is, which is kind of where these data sharing networks come into play. So by being a part of one of these data sharing networks, you can get back detections on your own fish elsewhere, as well as share those own unknown detections that you have in your own array. And there to the left, we are a part of the Atlantic Cooperative Telemetry Network, or the ACT network for short. And all those colored dots are representing other people's arrays throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. But there's also other data sharing networks, such as the Ocean Tracking Network. Up there more in Canadian waters, you have FACT, which operates from the Carolinas to the Caribbean, as well as ITAG in the Gulf of Mexico. And the neat thing here is that all of these organizations talk to one another and share data, so that just by being a part of one of them, like we are with the ACT network, you can still get detections back all throughout that geographic range. And so as you can imagine, this is extremely helpful when we're trying to study coastal movements of this species. So for this slide and for the next couple, I'm going to be talking about just our 2022 tag cohort of albies, because that's all we have migration data on at this point. But there's a couple of data pushes throughout the year from the ACT network where everybody uploads their data, and then you can singularly go in and download your own data from that. So this first set of detections that we got back after the fall of 2022 of tagging was in July of 2023. And that download contained detections spanning through April of 2023. And over there in the plot at the right, I have the detections color-coded by the months that they were recorded in. And if you look up there at the top right, those reds and oranges correspond to fish that were detected in October, November. And then you make a leap down towards North Carolina. Those fish were detected from, let's see, November through about March or April. And then one last leap down towards the Florida Keys. Those fish were detected in March and April. And fast forward this time to November of that same year, and now we have detections spanning through July of 2023. Here we filled out a couple more states and also starting to get a better sense of the timing of that migration, where it seems that once these fish leave our waters in November, they're making their way down anywhere from North Carolina through Florida. And then one last fast forward, this time to just this past March, where we had detections through September of 2023. And now we filled out pretty much the entirety of the East Coast below Nantucket Sound down to Florida. And just showing more of that same, where they are utilizing that region from North Carolina through Florida, from the winter through the summer. And the most exciting thing we just got back from this download too was that we actually had hits back inside the Gulf of Mexico on that western coast of Florida, which I always thought was possible given that we saw them in the Florida Keys from that first go around, but it is pretty interesting to see it laid out here like this. So just a few numbers to sum up all of that migration data from the 2022 tags. Out of 63 total tags, we detected 39 south of that New England, Long Island region. Of those 39, we detected 37 from North Carolina to Florida and 16 just in Florida. And of those Florida fish, we detected 6 in the Keys and 4 inside the Gulf of Mexico. And that plot right there is showing, those arrows are showing where they were originally tagged to where they were last detected, and that's color-coded by how long it took for them to get there. An exciting tidbit of news too is that we had 11 returns to Nantucket Sound in 2023 from those 2022 fish, and of those 9 were detected at some point in Florida and 2 were detected at some point from North Carolina. And the battery lives on those 2022 tags are now most certainly dead. They died sometime back in September of 2023, so we won't be getting detections back past then. But moving forward now, we're now tracking this 2023 cohort of tags, and those have battery lives lasting about a year and 4 to 5 months. So hopefully this upcoming fall season we'll be able to detect any and all returning albies that come back to our array in Nantucket Sound. And I just thought this was a fun little slide to include because it is absolutely mind-boggling how fast these fish can move. So coming from Florida to Nantucket Sound, on average, they can make that journey in 44 days from those fish that I was talking about previously. And then before this presentation, the last estimate I gave on the shortest migration time was 40 days. That's actually gotten knocked down to 21 days, so just 3 weeks. And if you combine just how fast they can move in a relatively confined space like Nantucket Sound with this long distance migration, I couldn't help but make this analogy that they're pretty much the ultimate combination of sprinters and marathoners. These fish can seriously do it all. They're little Energizer bunnies. And so that's all I have for today. Just a few key takeaways to keep this short and sweet because it's been a long day. But first is that acoustic tagging works. Again, we didn't know if we would get back detections at all on these fish, but it turns out that they can and do survive being tagged and released. And then in terms of what we found out, it's that they move all up and down the coast and likely form one single population with potential for connectivity into the Gulf of Mexico. And this also raises important questions like, how big is this population really? Because if you have a school of fish that can be here one day and a couple of states over the next, it can look like two bodies of fish when in fact it's one that's moving really, really fast. And so that again raises the question, how large is this population really? And then that in turn also means that if we want to manage this fish, it probably shouldn't be just at the state level or even a regional level, but likely on the scale of the entire coast at some point in order for there to be the most coordinated, effective management for the species possible. And with that, I'd just like to make some acknowledgements. All the wonderful folks at ASGA who have been collaborating with us on this project, Tony, Cody, and Will, as well as a bunch of other people behind the scenes who I just met today, and some who I haven't met yet, I'm sure. All of the captains who were out with us on those tagging trips, putting us on those fish. This project would not have been possible without them. If I tried to do this myself, I guarantee you I probably could have put out like 5 tags over the entire fall. And then also the volunteer anglers alongside them, they were fantastic, again, putting us on fish alongside the captains. And then last but not least, all the data providers along those arrays up and down the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. This is truly a collaborative project where if we didn't have detections from all the folks who provided them for us, none of the data that I showed you would have been possible. So a huge shout out to them as well. That's pretty much all I have, so thank you.